Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out to the southwest of Svatova, where there is this geolocated footage which shows there's been a slight Russian advance where they captured this fortification by the Ukrainians here in the forest patch. And with this, there is a small advancement by the Russians here in the Luhansk-Kharkiv border. Moving further south in the direction of Bakhmut, we have another advance by the Russians closer to Ivaniivka from the north. This indicates that there is further attempts by the Russians to advance towards the town of Ivaniivka, both from the east and from the north. And the attempts here by the Russians is to bypass the Ukrainian defenders here to the east, reach the village itself, and then the Russians will then launch attacks towards the town of Ivaniivka from the east to create a wide front line towards the town itself and try to start fighting over it, which would then lead to fighting towards the forest patches here to the west of it, and generally the fight to split the west of Bakhmut into the northern and southern parts. The fighting here to the west of Bakhmut, it's centered around the Russians launching some small assault groups as well as a lot of artillery support to launch attacks towards the town of Ivaniivka. All of the focus is currently around the town of Ivaniivka, which is being heavily bombarded by the Russians in the area, and with additional forces being sent to the front, there's enough to continue this push towards the town and start attacking it soon. At the same time, moving on further south in the direction of Avdiivka, we have seen advances everywhere across the front line, as since the ultimatum finished a couple of days ago, the Russians have been attacking non-stop, and they are very close to completely encircling the city. In the northern parts, they are still this 500 meters away from the road itself, which means that they have fire control over it, but they don't have it physically cut. As for the southern parts, after the capture of the military base and the fortifications of the Ukrainians here to the south, they are now also 500 meters from the supply route in and out of the citadel area that goes through here the south of the citadel area to the west up and towards the Sheverne through this direction, with the recent recapture of territory by the Ukrainians, which allows them to use this route. In this sense, the Russians are now very close to it from the eastern parts. This area itself, the road itself, is defended by these fortifications, these trench networks to the south of it. The Russians will likely look to capture these fortifications to get a solid control over the route. However, it is very close in proximity to the citadel area, which has a lot of high-rise buildings. This means that the Ukrainians would have good overview over these forest lines. What this means for the Russians is that it would be very difficult to gain control over these fortifications, considering they have supportive fire from the north, which allows them to have an overview over this whole situation here to the south. So with this, we see that the Russians will likely concentrate a large force to move through the forest areas and fight through them, instead of storming them head-on, which would cause a lot of casualties, considering they would be storming trenches from an open field with overview and fire support from the citadel area. So likely we'll see some fighting taking place to the south of it, but there's definitely fire control over the road. As we can see, the road itself goes to the south of the forest line. This means that the Russians here to the south of it would have direct view over the road itself. So Avdiivka is continuously operationally encircled, but we do see that they are very close to physically cutting off every single road. They could also simply move in from the western parts where they already have captured a bunch of these trenches, and with this cutting off the road right here would physically cut off the roads instead of having to fight over by the citadel area where the Ukrainians are most heavily defended. They can attack at an area where they are a bit weaker. Cutting it off there would yield the same results as the northern parts. However, here it would be a more solid control over it. Here the Ukrainians could simply launch a counterattack and recapture the road, while in the central parts it would be very difficult for them to do so. So whoever holds control over these fortifications here to the south of the citadel area has a firm control over the supply route. This is likely the main supply right now, considering that the Russians are so close to the northern parts, and with the rapid advances of the Russians here in the north, it is likely that this is less defended than the areas here to the south. The Russians managed to capture the military base and the fortifications in just one day due to a withdrawal of the Ukrainian units, as they were very close to being completely encircled. They decided to fall back, and in that fallback, the Ukrainians say that not all got out, this means that some were left behind as others retreated. And this means that they were very, very close to getting encircled, and there simply was no other choice for them. The current situation throughout this area is also that the Russians are moving in a northern direction from these fortifications and west of the residential area they have under their control, which would allow them to then storm these trenches head on here to the east. The Russian positions here are very close to the Ukrainian ones, and they are likely to attack from this eastern direction because, as we see from the satellite imagery, I'm not sure if it has changed since then, but these fortifications are in a western direction. They are in a western and southern direction. That means that the Russians attacking from the east would be attacking from a weak point of these fortifications. If the Russians are able to gain control over these trenches, then there would be a face-off between the trenches from the east to the west, and the Russians would have a much better position to move through the forest line and fight over by the central fortifications of the Ukrainians. So with these developments, we see that the Russians are very close to physically encircling the whole city. And that means that the positions here to the east especially are the most threatened. We see that the Ukrainians withdrew from the forest area and the water treatment plants here to the very eastern outskirts of Avdiivka, and as such the Russians now have control over the water treatment plant as well as fighting through the forest area. According to the latest Russian reports, they are currently clearing the forest area. If the Russians gain full control over the forest area, they'll be able to attack the city of Avdiivka itself from the eastern direction. And with that, combined with the advancements here to the south, the Russians could gain full control over the eastern parts very soon, as the Ukrainians are fighting while withdrawing, trying to slow down the Russian advances, but also getting better positions to possibly break out in case of an encirclement. In case the Russians physically cut off all supply routes in and out of the city, the Ukrainians will likely launch a counterattack trying to break out, whether it be here to the south of the citadel area or to the north of it. The Ukrainians would likely fight to get out rather than surrender. What we do see is that the northeastern parts here by the Dacia area, which is combined with a bunch of fortifications and trenches here as well, it is fairly isolated. If the Russians gain control over the forest patches here, then it would be physically cut off and encircled from the rest of the areas. This means that the Ukrainians here to the east needs to either withdraw or give up because, well, they're going to be encircled just like the rest of the city, but them by itself, as the Russian positions here to the north already have a direct fire control over the road in and out of the Dacia area. At the same time, if the Russians manage to gain control over the forest area, they would have a physical cut off of the road in and out of the Dacia area. And looking further north, there doesn't seem to be any fortifications from the old satellite imagery. There may be new ones, but with the Russians gain control over the road here in and out of the Dacia area, and with the positions here to the northwest, the Ukrainians would be completely stuck and completely isolated from the rest of the city. This means that the Ukrainians would have to fight to the last man or surrender or withdraw right now. In either case, the Russians will very likely soon get control over this whole area to the Dacia area. There are also reports of fighting by the cemetery, so it may already have happened. So with control over the forest areas here to the east, likely also the Dacia areas all the way to the cemetery, this whole area would fall under Russian control here to the east of Avdiivka. At the same time, there will be a lot of fighting here in the southern parts of the city. And considering the Ukrainians would likely gather here by the citadel area, the Russians will also gain control over the heights here to the south of the city, which would mean this whole area as well would be under Russian control. Fighting will likely continue by the supply routes, where the Ukrainians will look to hold their positions as much as possible, keep these supply lines active, while the Russians will look to attack all of these supply lines to try and fully encircle the city. As for the northern parts of the city, the Russians have here gained a foothold within the coke plant. So it looks like the Russians will likely look to capture the rest of the Dacia area and then start operations storming the coke plant, as they now have a foothold within the southern parts. With this, the Russians will look to gain full control over the coke plant here to the north of the city. It seems that the Russians are simply attacking everywhere at the same time. There is a Ukrainian source claiming that the Russians have a 1-7 advantage. That means for every Ukrainian fighting, there are 7 Russians fighting. And this would explain how the Russians are simply advancing everywhere. And at the same time, this means that the Ukrainians don't really consider the ones on the flanks as soldiers, because the Ukrainians throughout this battle have approximately 7 to 10,000 soldiers within the city of Avdiivka, and there has been 3 brigades sent as reinforcements that would add up to another 10,000, besides the fact that there's the 47th Mechanized Brigades and other brigades on the flanks, which would at least add up to 30,000. That means that the Russians, to have a 7-1 advantage, would need 210,000 soldiers, and well, that is obviously ridiculous. So they likely do not count the soldiers on the flanks, which would mean that the majority of the Ukrainian soldiers either completely withdrew from the city and they simply count 7,000 Russians against 1,000 Ukrainians, for example. That would be a 7-1 advantage. But in either way, the Russians likely do not have a 7-1 advantage on the whole section of the front, including the southern and northern flanks, but instead that they have a significant advantage within the city itself. But even that would be unlikely due to the fact that the Ukrainians hold the majority of the city, so the Russians being concentrated in a small part would mean that they're extremely vulnerable to artillery fire and so on. But then again, the Ukrainians are lacking in that section. They have a severe lack of ammunition, which could explain that the Russians could simply concentrate a lot of forces in a small area, and the Ukrainians are forced to split up as much as possible to avoid getting hit by these FAB strikes that are happening all the time, as we see with this picture here, which shows a lot of smoke rising from the city. And this is from the FAB strikes. There's also a report that the Russians have started launching FAB 1500s on the city of Avdiivka, specifically around the coke plant, which is the source of this black smoke in the distance. So we see that there's severe bombings of Avdiivka all the time in the areas of the Ukrainian positions. Moving on to the Pervomaisk area, there is this short advance by the Russians as they continue moving through and pushing through this town of Pervomaisk here to the southwest of Avdiivka. With this advance, the Russians are getting closer and closer to the central parts of the town, which would lead to the Russians getting firm control over this river line here to the south of Avdiivka, and it would strengthen the flank of the Russians here to the south of the city. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.